We're back in our timeline of the history of British broadcasting, November 1923. So, previously on the British Broadcasting Century. 1 year into the BBC's life, and the British Broadcasting Company now have 8 stations. From the BBC's first stations, London, Birmingham and Manchester, launching mid-November 1922.
Hello, Marconi House, London, calling.
Hello, this is 5IT.
Then the Newcastle station, Christmas Eve that year.
I did the announcing from the very first.
The launch of the BBC's first Welsh station, 5WA Cardiff, in February 1923.
This is 5WA, the Cardiff station of the British Broadcasting Company, calling.
And then its first Scottish station, Glasgow 5SC, 3 weeks later.
Hello, children.
Then there's a wait till October, and Aberdeen 2BD launches on 10th of October 1923, followed a week later by 6pm Bournemouth. That's 8 stations spanning mainland Britain. But 1 year into the BBC's life, there are areas it can't seem to reach, like Sheffield. And it turns out somebody has been trying for some time. Time to get them on board? Yes, it's the first relay station of the BBC, Sheffield 6FL, and that FL could just stand for Fred Lloyd, the one-man machine behind what began as an independent station, but eventually became the BBC's 9th and its first relay station. This episode will guide you through how Sheffield 6FL's relay station came to be.
And we had a landline to Manchester, and we rebroadcast the Manchester programmes.
And we bring you rare clips from BBC Radio Sheffield 58 years ago, with thanks to BBC Radio Sheffield and Sheffield City Archives.
You were pirates? Well, we weren't called pirates, but that's what it amounted to.
We are joined by the man who I'm sure knows more than anyone else on the planet about this under-researched and under-heralded landmark station. It's our newspaper detective Andrew Barker, as episode 125 dives finally back into our moment-by-moment timeline of what happened when, the other end of this British broadcasting century.
Hello, this is Paul Carenza calling.
This is
Sheffield. Hello, welcome to the podcast. I'm Paul Carenza, thank you for joining us, and after a few summer specials, we are delighted to be delving back into what happened when in the very earliest days of the BBC. Now, you might remember a few episodes ago, before we talked to you about the General Strike for its centenary and some events that you could go to this summer, whether you're at Edinburgh Festival seeing Asking Elvis with Mitch Benn, or on tour seeing The Archers live at 75 with Angela Barnes. We've looked at plays like the BBC's First Homosexual and early television with Professor John Wyver. If you've not heard those episodes, they are there for you. But before all of that, we celebrated the BBC's first birthday. It was episode 116, and they had a little bash to celebrate. So this episode will pick up the tale from there, what happened 2 days later as the BBC gained a new type of station in Sheffield, 6FL. But that wasn't the start of the Sheffield story, as we will tell you thanks to our special guest, Andrew Barker, our newspaper detective. Before that, though, we had a little regular feature we were trialling last couple of episodes. Look, we're not going to trial it for long. Okay, 1 or 2 more goes. We want to encourage you, if you haven't already, to review this podcast. Thank you if you have. I'm going to read out a few reviews, and then we'll pick a random winner. And the random winner will get a random fictitious prize linked with British broadcasting history that they can never claim. So, who will win this time? And of course, if you want to be in the running next time, drop a review on Apple Podcasts, and we too may be reading out your review, and you might be winning something pretend. Bewildered Dad writes, Paul has a brilliant way of bringing these stories to life. I've worked in radio for decades, but didn't know any of this stuff really. Properly enjoying this tale of how broadcasting began. Thank you, Bewildered Dad. 5 stars you kindly gave us. Appreciated. Will you be the winner of our fictitious prize? Or will it be Dave Lodge, who says, well done for such a well-researched show. I love the recreations of early broadcasts and the depth to which you delve into the detail of this fascinating history. Oh, trust me, you ain't seen nothing yet until this episode. We will be delving properly into the depths of Sheffield. What about then I Am a Trekkie, our third submission of a review for this episode. I'm a Trekkie, probably not your real name, says, a really enjoyable podcast for anyone who's interested in broadcasting media and social history. Paul's upbeat presenting style means that the listener gets to skip merrily through decades of history without feeling overwhelmed. Looking forward to the rest of the series. Well, thank you, I'm a Trekkie. Yeah, I think And I was going to give you the fictitious prize, but I've always liked Bewildered Dad's one. I've quoted that once or twice. Someone who's worked in radio for decades and didn't know any of this stuff, because you don't learn this. Who knows the history of the company they work for? Answers on a postcard, please, to A Giant Donut, W1A. So, Bewildered Dad, you win our fictitious prize this time. You can either have the representation of the ozone layer on the spinning BBC globe, or, if you'd rather, you can have Michael Howard's seat after Jeremy Paxman asked if he threatened to overrule someone 12 times. The choice isn't yours, because you can't actually have either, but I thank you for reviewing this podcast. And if you, dear listener, would like to review us, you know what to do. Review us. Thanks. So shall we go back then to November 1923? The BBC has been broadcasting for 1 year and 2 days. And it's time for a new station. But a station that when it started out wasn't really theirs.
We conceived a new plan, and that was the so-called relay stations.
Let's begin with Peter Eckersley. The real star is Fred Lloyd, but we'll get to Fred Lloyd. Eckersley is our man at the BBC, the chief engineer there. He talks about the main stations that they were trying to build.
It was obvious from experience that these 5 stations, 6 stations, 7 stations, whatever they were not enough.
Meant to be ultimately 9 of them. At this point of our timeline, November 23, they built 8 of them. They just got Belfast to go.
To fulfil the ideal of spreading the service over the whole of the British Isles, of giving a good signal-to-noise ratio everywhere.
In his book, The Power Behind the Microphone, he says, "Experience soon proved these stations had a service area no greater than 10 to 20 miles in radius. They could not, therefore, by themselves, cover the whole of Great Britain. The inadequacy of our main station service was brought home to me by a Mr. Lloyd, who burst into my office."
I remember the first proof of how our service was insufficient by a gentleman from Sheffield, a Mr. Lloyd, who walked into my office. He didn't knock, and he came straight in and he said, "Have you listened to wireless in Sheffield?" So I said, "I'm sorry, no, I haven't actually." He said, "Well, it's like an insurrection in hell." In other words, there was a good deal of interference with reception. And from that sprang the relay station.
So who was Fred Lloyd, and why did he burst into Peter Eckersley's office and demand a radio station? To tell us more, welcome our guest this episode, our newspaper detective, Andrew Barker.
So, on this occasion, you bring us this wonderful story of Sheffield. An unknown story, isn't it? I think it's fair. It's an underknown story.
It is. It's been hardly covered at all in the histories of broadcasting in the UK. When I first read the first volume of Asa Briggs' History of Broadcasting in the United Kingdom, that was over 50 years ago, I was intrigued by a particular sentence in that book. And the sentence was, "In Sheffield, wireless reception sounded like, quote, an insurrection in hell." I was to live in Sheffield for a few years. Many books about the early history of broadcasting, and none have covered the station to any degree. So when I did become the newspaper detective and started researching the early years of broadcasting history from the newspapers, that fascinated me. And it's an intriguing story that's been largely untold in the years since the station launched.
What was special then about the development of this new relay station in Sheffield?
It was to be a transmitter located in Sheffield with the intention of relaying programmes from a distant studio. That was said at the time that it would be the first such station in the world. Every other station had its transmitter within half a mile or so of the studio. But Sheffield was 150 miles from London and 40 miles from Manchester. Manchester was the nearest station. So it was intended that this would be a repeater station, purely relaying the broadcast from Manchester or London. But through the work of a couple of radio amateurs and the support of local newspapers, that changed and the scope of the station widened. Now, what happened here was that this was involving radio amateurs in the development of this station. And we've spoken in the past episodes about radio amateurs, Peter Eckersley being one, and we've also spoken about 5DJ, which was a small station run by radio amateurs. But in this case, the radio amateurs here had a much greater influence on broadcasting. It was an interesting story worth retelling, and it all started with a couple of radio amateurs, father and son, Frederick and Harry Lloyd.
On 17th of November 1968, Harry Lloyd, son of Fred Lloyd, spoke to the brand new BBC Radio Sheffield. A wonderful clip exists, and thanks to today's BBC Radio Sheffield and Sheffield City Archives, we can bring you this from 58 years ago.
45 years ago yesterday, November the 16th, 1923, Sheffield's first radio station under BBC control went on the air. But for about a year before that, Sheffielders were tuning into their own local programmes. Thanks to the efforts of Mr. Fred Lloyd, a well-known wireless amateur, a small number of enthusiasts could hear a couple of concerts a week.
More from the very early BBC Radio Sheffield very soon, and we're very grateful to today's station for permission to share that with you. So let's go right back to the beginning. I mean really back to the beginning, before the BBC even began, before the word broadcasting even existed, and we're only a year into peacetime after the Great War.
In October 1919, the Sheffield and District Wireless Society was formed. This was a group of amateurs, probably mostly people who'd served in the First World War and who'd bought radios as a result that were released after that war. By 1921, it had become the largest wireless society in England outside London.
An irony then that this city that would struggle so much to receive a BBC was one of the first in the country to have a growing wireless society. Just after the British Broadcasting Company formed as a company, but they hadn't been on the air yet. It's the 20th of October 1922, and this man Frederick Lloyd becomes the president of the Sheffield and District Wireless Society. He really makes it his own.
He was elected to presidency of the local wireless society.
Harry Lloyd on his father, Fred Lloyd.
As a first shot, he thought he would try the experiment, he called it an experiment, that he thought he would give his presidential address not directly in the Mappin Hall where the meeting was being held, but in the microphone, into the microphone of my wireless transmitter.
He delivers his very first broadcast from Ventnor Place, his own house. 800 people are listening in Mappin Hall, which is at the university, just down the road. And he uses this broadcast to plead that actually the city of Sheffield needs a broadcasting station. Bear in mind at this point, the BBC has not yet started broadcasting, but there's a buzz in the air in a good way. Part of that buzz means that actually Sheffield's local papers, and bear in mind this was a time when local papers were huge, that Sheffield Daily Telegraph actually get a radio receiver themselves. They see that actually there's a real use to having wireless in-house there.
He spoke to the local newspaper about this idea of his, and first of all, they were very sceptical. In fact, Sir Charles Clifford, who was the principal of the paper at that time, he had heard some wireless and he described it as sounding like an insurrection in hell.
Yes, there doesn't seem to be agreement on where the phrase
Well, it's like an insurrection in hell.
An insurrection in hell
came from with regard to Sheffield Broadcasting. Heard it from 3 different places, and that's another origin story.
This was the Yorkshire Telegraph and Star in those
it
days.
Was, yes. At any rate, he suggested that they had a wireless receiver at their offices in Fargate, and that they pick up his presidential address delivered to the Mappin Hall by wireless and print it in a special edition, which in fact they did. There was a special edition of the paper delivered to the university before the end of the meeting. However, repercussions came back quite quickly from the Postmaster General, who objected to this use of an amateur transmitting licence.
You were pirates?
Well, we weren't called pirates, but that's what it amounted to. We weren't broadcasting pop music and that kind of. He went up to see the PMG. I don't think he saw the PMG personally, but he saw his representative, and he persisted that this was an experiment. Of course it was an experiment. It was the first time anything like that had been done.
Then, on the 24th of November, just 10 days after the start of BBC broadcasting, Fred Lloyd made a second broadcast from his home to a capacity audience of members and friends of the Wireless Society, again at the university. It included a talk from the rather nervous Lord Mayor, and for the first time, some gramophone records were played and broadcast.
And he connects with the BBC. He relays the news from the Manchester station 2ZY. The very idea of relaying any broadcast is something that will certainly crop up throughout this story, as will the notion of whether Sheffield can get Manchester broadcast content.
He made a third broadcast on New Year's Eve, December 1922, broadcasting again from his home. One of the speakers was the Bishop of Sheffield, said to be the first English prelate to broadcast, and also speaking with a local MP and the editor of one of Sheffield's newspapers. The newspapers took a major role in this process and were very interested in broadcasting. Then, on the 21st of March 1923, Fred Lloyd, president of the Wireless Society, broadcast again from his own home to 3 schools in the city. And this was the first educational broadcast for schools in Britain.
Incredible to think that education broadcasting looks like it started at Sheffield as a pre-BBC station. That's largely unreported, and yet, how iconic is that? Bringing the middle part of inform, educate and entertain long before the BBC did.
Speeches by the city's chair of the Education Committee and the Director of Education were broadcast, along with a history lesson, and also a story in French was relayed from the Eiffel Tower station.
On education broadcasting, Fred Lloyd wrote in his notebook at the time, "I'm told by the bigwigs that this experiment is too ambitious. Let me tell you that nothing is too ambitious for Sheffield. We're going to set the pace. We're going to be in the front. One day, it may be possible to broadcast to all schools within a radius of 20 or 30 miles. And what's more, if I can get more watts for the transmitter, I would be heard in Berlin or even New York."
Now, Fred Lloyd is actually involved in the BBC as well. He's a shareholder of the company, as many, many people were. So this is the point where he turns up.
He didn't knock.
And he faces the powers that be, or the powers that beeb.
He came straight in and he said, "Have you listened to wireless in Sheffield?" So I said, "I'm sorry, no, I haven't actually." He said, "Well, it's like an insurrection in hell."
And little better than a farce. And that was reported in some papers had been said by Fred Lloyd. But one of the local papers said that it was actually stated by another attendee. And the insurrection was ascribed to oscillation caused by amateurs trying to pick up weak signals from distant stations.
He said you need a really expensive 4-valve set to hear any BBC station in Sheffield. Because, of course, the BBC's planted these 8 stations around the country. Well, 6 by that point. And really, none of them reach Sheffield. Manchester's the nearest. But you've got a pretty hilly area in the way between them. There was reassurance from the BBC chairman, Lord Gainford, that later that summer Manchester would increase their power, enough that Sheffield would hear quite well. But, that didn't happen. So Peter Eckersley went to Sheffield.
So about 3 weeks later, Peter Eckersley arrived in Sheffield, and what they did was made an unannounced transmission test for London. London wouldn't normally have broadcast at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, but they did this time when no other station was broadcasting. It was found that reception at that time was clear of interference. They made a further listening test at 8 p.m. when Sheffield amateurs were trying to listen to other stations that suffered from howling, so the interference from the various radio sets. And Peter Eckersley said that Sheffield is badly shielded from the nearest broadcasting station, Manchester. A couple of days later, Peter Eckersley stated that it was in his intention to construct a relay station for Sheffield, based on his experiences in the city. His plan at that time was for 2LO to be received by wireless at a location outside the city, with a landline connection between this location and the transmitter in the city. There was no indication that the relay station would carry local programming at this time. It would just be a repeater station, mirroring the output of a main station. However, Fred Lloyd had plans. Whilst in Sheffield, Peter Eckersley spoke at the university, and after his talk, Fred Lloyd broadcast music from his home studio to the audience in the lecture theatre. Then on the 12th of May, Sheffield Independent stated that permission for the relay station to be erected was still awaiting sanction from the Post Office.
There was an expectation by May 1923 that whatever this station was going to be in Sheffield, it would be controlled and operated by just one person, an engineer, one guesses, and therefore no local programmes from this new, smaller Sheffield station. Fred Lloyd visits London in June 1923 to look at the experimental work being carried out to set up this relay station. But he does not stop broadcasting. 6th of June 1923, for example, Fred Lloyd is on the air from his own home every Monday evening between 8 and 8:30, call sign 2UM, 2
And his son, Harry Lloyd, assisted with the engineering aspects.
You'd built your own by this time, had you?
I was running an amateur transmitting station under the call sign 2UM, and I remember it was a 10-valve amplifier with the first 3 valves hung in tumblers of oil to stop the ponging, microphoning.
Peter Eckersley contracts a deputy, an assistant chief engineer for him at the BBC, who does seem to have been hired for this very development. Captain West is the guy they get. He stays for years. You'll find him giving us the cello and the nightingale before long, developing all sorts of technologies for the BBC, but it starts with Sheffield. And Captain West has been experimenting at this new temporary home of the relay station at Sheffield University.
Short time later, towards the end of June, Captain West, he'd been experimenting at the university, and test transmissions were due to start for the experimental station within a few days. At that time, he broadcasted a message from Fred Lloyd's home during one of the regular Monday transmissions to members of the Sheffield Wireless Society. And he stated that he soon planned to test the wireless reception of 2LO to see if it could be used for a relay station.
So Fred Lloyd also makes a speech where he does talk about the plan to attempt to receive 2LO from London and retransmit them or relay them by telephone line. Lloyd said that this was a new thing, never been done before in England, and he believed it hadn't been done in America. Those were really the only 2 places I think he was thinking about. He said he hoped the experimental station would broadcast twice a week and would not initially be a relay station. So, to start with, the station would have some local content.
These experiments were carried out during the summer vacation of 1923. And as the weeks went on, we could see that these experiments would take some time, and the university had to say, sorry, but we can't accommodate you when the term begins. You'll have to find somewhere else to live. And Captain Eckersley came up to see what possibilities there were, and there weren't any immediate possibilities, so my father agreed to, for the time being, to let them use his house in Ventnor Place as the broadcasting station.
On the 16th of July, a decision was made to move the experimental station to Fred Lloyd's home at Ventnor Place. The university location had suffered from shielding, which means that it couldn't be heard across Sheffield because of the obstructions. So that necessitated the move.
And so my little 10-watt transmitter was scrapped, and we brought down this 100-watt gear from the university, installed it in the stable outside the house, and other outbuildings were used for charging accumulators. The drawing room was draped with green baize, and the microphone and the preamplifiers were installed there.
Fred Lloyd's home studio then was in his drawing room, which Wireless Weekly said had been turned almost upside down. More broadcasts in mid-July, playing pianola and gramophone records, and speaking as well. The quality improved as Fred Lloyd got in volunteers who could play piano, give the odd conversational piece or some informative talks. Occasionally you might hear a violin played by Fred Lloyd himself. Twice a week, Mondays and Thursdays, 8 p.m. for half an hour. So this is all happening on the air while the technical stuff is happening off the air for the BBC to work out how to create this new transmitter that could relay a signal. According to Peter Eckersley's biography at Prospero's Wireless, this was his first coup in setting up the BBC's engineering department, especially its R&D section. Just because there was no transmitter like this on the market, he thought, fine, the BBC can make one. To get it going, of course, Eckersley had other jobs to do, so he got his deputy, Captain West, to work on the design of this new transmitter for Sheffield. To do so, West was given a workshop at the top of the BBC HQ at Savoy Hill. The trouble was, this workshop was also the rehearsal room for the band. Rather disruptive sound-wise for both engineers and performers.
What about the programmes? What sort of programmes did you do?
The programmes were evening programmes. The local talent was very, very cooperative.
What do you mean by local talent?
Singers, instrumentalists, the odd comedian.
They all came into your father's drawing room?
They all came, yes. Oh, it was sheer chaos. On Sundays, there was an address from one of the representatives of the religious denominations.
The experimental station began Sunday programmes. These started actually on the 30th of July with the church's evening. Then on Sunday, 5th of August, the programme would be for nonconformists, and the following Sunday for Catholics.
That was quite groundbreaking at the time, something the BBC weren't really doing themselves. Different denominations for different Sundays. 8th of August 1923, Wireless Weekly report that local listeners are saying, "Why go to the trouble of providing the relay station when we can broadcast direct with no trouble?" Local content versus relaying from elsewhere. Controversial. And still happening to this very day.
And this was all in your father's drawing room at Sharrow, but then eventually you moved down to Corporation Street to bigger premises, didn't you, which you built?
Well, I built the transmitter and fitted out the studio.
A new premises is found 9th of August 1923. The BBC finds a place for a permanent relay station at the Union Grinding Wheel Company. Sounds rather loud, and it is rather grimy. It's a 2-storey building that was already over 100 years old. So imagine that takes us back to the early 1800s and what that would have been like.
The station would take up a vacant part of the first floor. Not by coincidence, Fred Lloyd was a director at the Union Grinding Wheel Company, so it used his influence to find this suitable location.
Did this mean you were able to do much more ambitious kinds of programmes?
Well, by that time, with the experiments that had already been carried out, we had abandoned the idea of radio relaying, and we had a landline to Manchester, and we rebroadcast the Manchester programmes.
The first attempt at trying to relay a station happened in mid-August of 1923. So says the Sheffield Daily Telegraph. The broadcasting company have erected the receiving station at Green Hill, this spot being chosen so that the messages will be as free as possible from interference. When the broadcasted messages arrive in Sheffield, they become mixed up with extraneous noises, and by receiving the signals at Green Hill before they get to Sheffield, this is avoided. They will then be boosted up or strengthened, and by a landline will be conveyed to another station in Sheffield, whence they will be sent out with very much greater strength.
So as tests continued, Fred Lloyd stated that he wished for the local programmes to continue when the relay station opened.
And he has hundreds of letters agreeing with him. He is putting out the best content that he can to show that Sheffield can do it and doesn't need to just receive content from elsewhere. 1st of September 1923, local newspapers are brought into the fold as well. They've been firm friends with Fred Lloyd and all of those involved in the Sheffield station for some time, but they're given their own evening of broadcasting. The newspapers can take to the airwaves. Now, of course, the BBC would never have let them do that, but the Sheffield station, they're independent. They can do what they want.
The Sheffield Independent reported that this wireless takeover would be carried out by a couple of local singers and various staff of those newspapers. The concert consisted of music, song and a story, including that of a newspaperman who admitted that he would go to the barber shop in newspaper time. This would be only the second occasion in Britain of a newspaper sponsoring a broadcast. The first being Dame Nellie Melba's broadcast from Chelmsford in 1920. The only other earlier sponsored concert at this time on a BBC station was the Harrods Gala concert in spring 1923.
But elsewhere in technical realms, by 7th of September it's decided that Manchester will have the content that's relayed in Sheffield by landline. And that line itself is going to run over the Snake Pass. I've driven it myself, rather hazardous in icy conditions. It's quite high. That means that stormy weather can actually disrupt the signal. Now that means that Fred Lloyd's own station, surely, is done for. And they already start to plan its demise, to be closed with a speech by Sir Arthur Balfour, Britain's Prime Minister from 20 years before then. While they were still winding down, they had speeches from Captain Ian Fraser of St Dunstan's Charity for the Blind. He had been part of London's first broadcast, in fact, in the summer of 1921, a year before the BBC existed, and he'd later become a BBC governor, and the first life peer. 12th of September, you get a petition of letters that's interesting, that really wants this Sheffield relay station to have local content. And there's a lot of backing from the Sheffield Chamber of Commerce about this. It shouldn't just relay content. It should have Sheffield-made programmes. Now, there's a good reason that the Chamber of Commerce want this, of course. If you can get local content, local businesses might be mentioned. One may even call it advertising. But all good things come to an end, and that dream of local content seems to do just that. The conclusion of Fred Lloyd's experimental station.
On the 13th of September 1923, the experimental station made its final broadcast from Fred Lloyd's house, with the speech by Sir Arthur Balfour and the speech by the President of the Sheffield Chamber of Commerce.
The Sheffield Independent, 14th of September 1923.
Probably for the last time, transmission was sent out from the temporary wireless station at Ventnor Place, Sheffield. In future, the relay station in Corporation Street will be used. The final programme was an excellent one. Towards the end of the programme, 2 listeners who had come to the house forcibly ejected Mr. Lloyd from the transmitting room while they proposed over the wireless a vote of thanks to him and his son and their helpers for the good work which has been done.
The final programme was heard by many people in a local park as the Burndet demonstration van relayed it through loudspeakers. So the Burndet demonstration van toured the country. It looked like a rather large radio receiver, and it was there specifically for this final broadcast. It was stated that the relay station, when it opened officially, would include local programming on one evening each week. Harry Lloyd, Fred Lloyd's son, would be in charge of the station, with Fred Lloyd to be responsible for local programmes during this initial 3 months.
We had a rather extended local service, particularly perhaps a children's hour, which was very popular. Mr. Jenner came down as a station director, and he called himself Uncle Herbert. There was one of the engineers who was rather good at entertaining. I think his name was Mr. Bean. He called himself Uncle Socrates. A lady who was now my wife was Auntie Elsie, and Mr. Jenner's wife was another of the aunties.
And what sort of things did they all do?
It was rather parochial, perhaps, by present-day standards, but it was all very amusing. They used to sing songs and give readings from children's books. They had birthday greetings. A badge was printed, a little enamel badge, and the children could join the radio circle and display this little badge on their lapels.
I wonder how many of the children from those days are listening to us now, who remember being a member of the Children's Circle.
Thanks once again to several institutions that made these clips possible to bring to you. The British Library Sound Archives, especially Stephen there. The Sheffield City Archives, Tim has been very helpful there. And BBC Radio Sheffield, thank you, Rob, for making that happen. I found it personally a fascinating story in itself. The British Library in London has catalogued that Harry Lloyd recording, yet even though it's digital, it's held by Sheffield City Archives, but it's owned by BBC Radio Sheffield, and yet copyright is such that it may be beyond copyright anyway, because it's more than 50 years old. But those are the owners, the holders, and the cataloguers, 3 different institutions who have all been very helpful in helping bring that to you. Caps doffed. There are further experiments throughout October, relaying the BBC's Manchester station, gaining some praise and quite a lot of complaints from listeners. But it's decided that the official start date will be the 16th of November 1923. That's why we've chosen to ground this here in our timeline just after the BBC's first anniversary. There is a proper opening ceremony relayed to all BBC stations, and that includes speeches by John Reith, the BBC's general manager, by the Lord Mayor of Sheffield, and by Sir William Clegg, the chair of the city's education committee, who was one of those in that very first educational broadcast to schools. Also speaking, General Sir Frederick Sykes, chair of the Sykes Inquiry, that had recently concluded that the BBC needed an elevated role in society and a change in the licence situation that would give it a bit more money.
The relay stations were about 200 or 300 watts in the aerial.
Peter Eckersley.
The idea was that you plunked them down in the middle of a city such as Sheffield, which was getting a bad service from Manchester. You plunked them down in Edinburgh, which was getting a bad service from Glasgow, and in Stoke and so on. The
Sheffield station paved the way for other relay stations just like it. Lower power relaying elsewhere. You've got Sheffield from the 16th of November 1923. You've got Plymouth from March 24. Edinburgh in May that year, Liverpool in June, Leeds and Bradford in July, Hull, Nottingham, Stoke-on-Trent, Dundee and Swansea, all through 1924. And in the autumn of that year as well, one more main station, 2BE Belfast, all to come on the British Broadcasting Century.
And for a very, very small expenditure of money, because it didn't cost a great deal. You hung the aerial on the chimney, you had a little transmitter which was not more than 200 or 300 watts. And, of course, that gave, over such a limited area, a very good signal. And the licenses began to pour in. Indeed, I think that the relay station policy had something to do with the build-up of licenses and our revenue. Because if we had tried to stick to the medium wave stations, undoubtedly there would have been a very large area of disgruntled people who couldn't get the reception free from noise. Now, that was very well. There were the medium wave stations, 1.5 kilowatts. There were the relay stations. There was one trick we had which was quite amusing, which we learned by experience, and that was that the people would tune in or get their receivers adjusted to a new station, and very soon those receivers would deteriorate, and then there would be complaints that the station wasn't big enough. So, what we did was to start up the stations, the relay stations, on half power. Then there would be a lot of complaints. And Captain Eckersley would then go up and give a lecture in the town hall. It was very popular at that time. And say, yes, I hear there are complaints. Yes, well, I'll look into it. Yes, you see. And next morning we turned it up to double power, and a wonderful man, BBC.
The opening was a little controversial, though. Its schedule wasn't listed in the Radio Times, and in neither print nor on air was it mentioned that so much work had been done in the build-up to this by the Sheffield and District Wireless Society, who complained about it afterwards. As you've heard this episode, they had been tireless in developing radio in Sheffield, but it was really seen as the British Broadcasting Company making a brand new start, and the clock starting there and then. All the rest was prehistory, and not worth talking about. As is clear in his letter to the Sheffield Daily Telegraph, 20th of November 1923.
Sir, I'm instructed by my committee to write and express their surprise at the fact that your report of the opening of the local relay station, no mention was made of the work done in the past by the Sheffield and District Wireless Society in connection with the more efficient reception of broadcasting in Sheffield. This is all the more astonishing when it's recalled that the previous public meetings were held under the auspices of this society, presided over by its late president. Further, no invitations to take part in Friday evening's performance was received by this society. It's regrettable that the British Broadcasting Company, or whoever was responsible for the arrangements, should have omitted to consult the only society which has endeavoured to educate the people of this city during the last 4 years in the science of wireless communication and its infinite possibilities. R. Jakeman, Honorary Secretary, Sheffield and District Wireless Society.
Which was replied to by the Sheffield Daily Telegraph editor.
No mention was made of the Sheffield Wireless Society in our report because the society was not referred to during the proceedings. There seemed to be conflicting claims as to who really did father wireless in Sheffield. But it does seem regrettable that a society which has done such good work should have been ignored in this manner.
Well, thanks to Andrew Barker and his tireless research, we are delighted to set the record straight this episode about who did father wireless in Sheffield. Surely deserving of credit are indeed Sheffield and District Wireless Society, but particularly Fred Lloyd.
Mr. Lloyd, now that we've come full circle, as it were, what are your thoughts about local radio, what we might be able to achieve?
Well, now that you have come full circle, it might be possible to develop or redevelop, in the light of all modern improvements, the schools broadcast that we did in a very primitive way carry out in those days.
It's worth restating that this isn't anywhere. It's not like you've got this from a book. How have you found all this? This is just newspaper detective being newspaper detective, is it?
Absolutely. This is reading the local Sheffield newspapers, which probably weren't so easily accessible to Asa Briggs, and they wouldn't have had time with all the other things that were going on. And it was actually quite an important piece of radio broadcasting history. The fact that this was the first relay station, it was thought to be the first one in the world, where the transmitter was very, very distant from the studio.
We will pick up the tale with 6FL going forward from November 1923. But as Andrew Barker notes, it took until the 7th of February the following year, 1924, till the Sheffield relay station was actually given a name, a call sign of 6FL. But why FL? Sorry, not YFL, but why, WHY, FL. And there's a couple of different versions of this story in existence, but in the Peter Eckersley biography Prospero's Wireless, I particularly like this one. The call sign was meant to be 6SL, that 6FL could honour the pioneering work of the Sheffield station's founder, Fred Lloyd. Peter Eckersley, the BBC's chief engineer, didn't really have a say in the matter, but he did his bit. Eckersley knew that there would be disapproval of favouritism by the Postmaster General, the government man in charge. So Eckersley said that as the BBC were taking over this station, he had misheard the official call sign from the General Post Office and printed loads of stationery for this new BBC station, not as 6SL, as intended, but, oh, look, Eckersley's written it as 6FL, which happens to stand for Fred Lloyd as well. The Postmaster General's assistant, Mr. Brown, he'd known of Eckersley of old. He apparently saw right through this ruse/tribute to Fred Lloyd, but he relented as, quote, a gesture to a Machiavellian chief engineer. So 6FL it is. Thank you, Fred Lloyd, and thank you for thanking him, Peter Eckersley. At times, rivals for the future of the Sheffield station, but ultimately friends.
Fred Lloyd was an innovator. He had strong views. He had influence because he was an important part of the community with his connections with the Chamber of Commerce, with his connections with the education department, the university.
How do you think we should view Fred Lloyd and Harry Lloyd then? Because these are forgotten names. It's even in broadcasting history, aren't they? Really?
Well, I think he was a major influence because the influence there was that he did get the radio station to provide local programming. And if Fred Lloyd hadn't taken this initiative, it may well be that the other radio stations might have just been repeater stations without local programming, just leaving it to the main stations.
Well, we've a lot to thank you pioneers for, Mr. Lloyd, in those days, 44 years ago, and here we are starting off again.
Yes, here we are starting off again, and I'm very pleased to be still alive when these developments take place, and I do hope that the new Radio Sheffield will have a very, very successful career.
Mr. Harry Lloyd talking to Michael Barton.
We will come back to Sheffield and look at its future, because it could be argued that a couple of months after that, January 1924, that Sheffield, with its weekly local piece of content, actually gave us perhaps the first local star comedian, Arthur Clifford, a schoolmaster.
One agriculturalist even taught his cows to Charleston, semi-frantic, so that they could churn their own milk, semi-curdled.
Who got a bit of Sheffield stainless steel, quite famous, bent it round his bowler hat, and changed his name to Stainless Stephen.
Another crossed his bees with glowworms to allow of them working a night shift.
Voted in 1932 the most popular radio artiste by one newspaper. He wore a rotating bow tie on stage and a stainless steel vest. Shame, of course, that you couldn't see it in audio.
Wireless was introduced on the trains. These sets whistle when approaching stations. Out of a total of 2,000,001 British trains passing through tunnels last year, not one of them missed a hole.
Stainless Stephen only retired in 1952. He even guested on David Frost's TV show in 1969. That feels quite recent in the grand scheme of things.
Behind the scenes at the BBC is the most a mystery. So come with me and visit that great hive of industry. The building stands just off the Strand, the stone's throw from the river. And dirty work goes on there that will make you listeners shiver.
Just as today's Gladiators has a character called Steel, so too over 100 years ago did Sheffield, the home of steel, bring us Stainless Stephen. Someone really should do a book called From Stainless Stephen to Steel, Sheffield's contribution to BBC entertainment, with a nice picture on the front of Stainless Stephen and a gladiator.
It's things like this that happen here and are happening still, which take place behind the scenes way down in Savoy Hill. The chief engineer with a great problem now must come to grips. Shout, send out for some more oranges. The time signals run out of pips. 2 green motors next drive up. For them an armed guard is waiting, filled with pirates who will be shot at dawn for oscillating. A gun fires, the alarm sounds. Now comes the final crisis. Send an SOS and bloodhounds out. Someone's pinched the fat stock prices. I've been so faint, I'm staggering. Oh, what is wrong with me? London Calling, stainless Stephen's poison, down at the BBC.
Before we go, let's have a very brief look at some other things going on elsewhere in the BBC's reach in mid-November 1923. On air, or indeed off air, on the 16th of November, so says the Press and Journal, the Aberdeen station had a breakdown.
Following a complete blank day on Friday owing to a mysterious breakdown, the Aberdeen Broadcasting Station resumed operations on Saturday afternoon. From Friday afternoon right up to Saturday forenoon.
You don't get the word forenoon very often, do you? I think they mean morning.
The company's engineers worked incessantly to locate the trouble and have it put right. It was discovered, ultimately, that the trouble was due principally to an intermittent and elusive disconnection in the high-tension part of the transmitting apparatus. The trouble was located in time to commence its usual afternoon programme at 3:30.
From the health of your radio station to the health of people, 19th of November 1923, a new programme made it to the air called Tonic Talk. It was a health-based show, you know, a bit like those two twins who talk on the air today, Dr. Zand and the other one. But this one was actually hosted by a Dr. Frank Crane. Yes, Dr. F. Crane on the radio. Bit like Frasier. The Daily Mirror, 19th November 1923.
Tonic Talks are the latest novelty in the wireless programme. Mr. William Hallman, who's been selected to deliver these talks on how to keep fit, owes his appointment to the fact that his voice gives the impression of health. Mr. Hallman is a wireless star, and recently returned from Paris, where he used to broadcast from the Eiffel Tower extracts from Shakespeare for the benefit of the English and American people in France.
The London Daily News the next day weren't so sure.
Wireless horrors. It is a momentous piece of news that Dr. Frank Crane's famous tonic talks to the people are to be broadcast by wireless. How will the vast broad-catching public respond to the eloquent musings of the greatest glimpser of the obvious of modern times? Will it, after experimenting curiously with the first few transmissions of Crane's revivifying mixture, thereafter lay the receiver down at the opening whiff of the nightly tonic gas, and quietly resume its knitting in its newspaper? All we have to say is that if it really starts in this country a Crane school of thought of equal magnitude, the law which forbids suicide, we say nothing about homicide, ought instantly to be revoked.
You've got to read between the lines a bit, but I think that is a scathing review. Elsewhere then, 24th November 1923, I think it's worth mentioning this letter that John Reith, the head of the BBC, wrote to his mum. We have featured on the podcast before how John Reith insisted on reading the news so his mum could hear. She forgot to listen, so he insisted on doing it again. Well, on this occasion, he writes to her.
My dearest mother, this is the first sheet of writing paper with my name on it, so I'm sending it to you. Also a spare sheet, which you can show Douglas.
John Reith's brother.
I wonder if you heard the opera from the Old Vic this evening. It was sent by wireless across the Thames, and then re-wirelessed from London. I shall not let any more racing news be included than we can help. We have already cut it down quite a bit.
So, no racing on the BBC? You can blame Mrs. Reith. Around a similar time, John Reith is offering airtime to political parties for the upcoming general election. I believe they turned him down, but not the year after. October 1924 was seen to be the first British broadcasting parliamentary election. 23 then the last without its involvement. Next time on the podcast, the BBC has been trying to go national, but it's also trying to go international. Just as they were developing the Sheffield station, they were also developing how to broadcast to America the same day that the Sheffield Daily Telegraph was printing about its opening plans on the 13th November 23. That very same day, further south in the Westminster Gazette,
BBC to talk to America, extensive wireless tests. A series of transatlantic broadcast tests are to be made between the 26th of November and the 2nd of December. The object is to ascertain whether British broadcasting can be received in the United States.
Next time, Professor Simon J. Potter and BBC producer Josephine McDermott, who has made a wonderful archive on 4 that we'll talk more about next time. But if you'd like to hear it, it's called The Sound of Soft Power. You can find it on BBC Sounds. You can find Simon J. Potter's books out there, including his centenary book, This is the BBC, Entertaining the Nation, Speaking for Britain. And he joins us next time. If you enjoy the podcast and would like to support us, patreon.com/Paul Carenza is a way you can do that. For £5 a month, there's extra writings and videos and things like that. It all keeps this going because it helps fund the research and the books and the web hosting. And I'm grateful to any patrons who are there for us. You could also share the podcast, of course. You can review it, and if you review it, we might mention that review on the air. You could win a fictitious piece of British broadcasting history. And you can find us on Facebook and Blue Sky. And of course, stay subscribed. And next time, you'll hear episode 126 on the BBC going international from the 26th of November, 1923, way back across just over one British broadcasting century.
A podcast presented and produced by Paul Carenza. Original music is by Will Farmer. We are very grateful to Andrew Barker, our newspaper detective, for both his words and his newspaper clippings this episode and many episodes. This podcast is, of course, nothing to do with today's BBC whatsoever, and our thanks to BBC Radio Sheffield, the Sheffield City Archives, and the British Library for those clips from BBC Radio Sheffield in 1968. If you would like to hear more of them, do ask, and maybe a future time we will.
Stay informed, educated and entertained. And join us next time to hear about the BBC going global, far beyond Sheffield, here on the British Broadcasting Century.